Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 12 of the regular season between the Sharks and the Kings, in which the Sharks have lost 6-2. So once again, the Sharks are splitting one of these two-game series with the team that they have been playing against, but the major problem with that is in this series against the Kings, in the early season series against the Arizona Coyotes, and the series against the St. Louis Blues, while the Sharks are technically going 1-1, the other team is going 1-0. So the Sharks are only earning 2 points from these two-game series, while the other team is earning 3 points. So each time that the Sharks are getting these shootout victories and then losing the next game, they're losing just a tiny bit of ground in the standings. And as these two-game series begin to add up, that small bit of ground is going to end up snowballing into a few points behind for the Sharks if they cannot start either at least splitting 1-1 with regulation wins or getting some 2-0 series against these teams. Now, this game, while it looks quite bad with the 6-2 loss, was actually a lot weirder and closer than this. I'll start off with the first period. The Kings get the first 3 goals of this game from Kopitar, from Grundstrom, and from Wagner, and then the Sharks will get one from Hertl near the end of the first period to make it 3-1 after 20 minutes. And then in the second period, the Sharks scored the only goal of that frame, getting another from Hertl, and so it's 3-2 for the Kings after 40 minutes. Now, analyzing that just from an outside perspective, you would say, well, the Sharks were heavily outplayed in the first period, going down 3-1, and then played a decent second period to get one back on the board. But in fact, you could very well argue that the Sharks' second period was not just worse, but significantly worse than the first period that they played. While the first period they gave up 3 goals, of course, they were, I would say, the vastly better team in terms of play that period, and mostly just got somewhat unlucky when it comes to some of these goals. This Grundstrom one deflecting in off of his leg, the Kings getting a very timely clear after sustained heavy pressure from the San Jose Sharks, where it's a question how they managed to not score on this play that would eventually lead to this Austin Wagner breakaway out of the penalty box. And then Kopitar's was on the power play, but at even strength, the Sharks were, I would say, clearly the much better team in the first period, and yet not rewarded for that. And in the second period, the Sharks once again kind of blundered around a bit, as they have been doing in the second period all season, and yet outscored the Kings 1-0. Now, of course, if you were to ask somebody, would you rather play a good period but be down 3-1 or a bad period and be up 1-0? Obviously, most people would say the bad period and being up 1-0, because in the end, it's the scoreboard, that's all that matters. But just to say that this was a pretty strange game, and the 6-2 loss doesn't necessarily look as bad for the Sharks. And just to carry on with that, we take a look at what ended up happening in the third period. This Anderson Dolan goal that makes it 4-2 is one that's just a blunder by Erik Karlsson, as it's sort of like I can't even say that this is a misplay from Erik Karlsson necessarily. I'm not going to chastise him for making this, because it's kind of just again a weird, unfortunate play where he kind of fans on this one. He just overskates it, I guess you could say, and it allows for the easy tap in for Anderson Dolan. You take a look at this Alex Iafallo goal, and this is off of, again, another very strange situation. Brent Burns high sticks Dustin Brown. Brown, of course, has to act as though he just got murdered at this point, falls to the ice, continues sliding forward, crashes into Martin Jones, takes him completely out of the play, allowing for an easy tap in for Iafallo. And while the Sharks end up challenging on this play, they call it a good goal because they say that Dustin Brown was sort of impeded with, and as such, it's kind of the Sharks' fault that Brown ends up crashing into Martin Jones, which I guess I can technically see the reasoning for, with air quotes around that. But it does also set a bit of a dangerous precedent for other players around the league, because at this point, it's sort of the green light that if you get impeded with around the net, well, you might as well sort of act it up and crash into the goaltender, because then it technically isn't your fault for anything that happens after that. So if you get tripped up, if you get high sticked, if you get interfered with, you might as well act up as much as possible, crash into the goaltender, take them out of the play, and try and get an easy tap-in goal, because apparently that's going to be something that will stand. Now, I will say that, the NHL referees and then the word consistency don't normally find themselves in the same sentence, so I would doubt that this would necessarily stand that much in other games, but just to say, it was a bit of a strange call. And then eventually, because of the Brent Burns' high-sticking penalty onto Dustin Brown and the failed challenge, the Sharks would drop 5-on-3 for 2 full minutes, which Jeff Carter would capitalize on to take the 6-2 lead and finish out this game. First thing to talk about would be Jones, and of course, 6 goals in any game let in for a goaltender is never a great look. Jones actually ends up getting the start here tonight because of an injury to Devan Dubnyk. We'll see if Dubnyk can return sooner rather than later, because Jones, while he's been good in short spurts, getting one game here or there, it seems as though whenever he gets more than a single game in a row, it doesn't really last all that well. Jones, it's hard to necessarily put too much blame on him. This, of course, the Grundstrom goal deflects off of his leg. The Wagner goal is a breakaway. The Anderson Dolan one and the Iafallo ones he has absolutely zero chance on. But then you also look at this Kopitar goal and he's a bit off angle here, maybe overcompensating for his weak short side of the past couple of games. Then you look at the Carter one, and while this was a cross-ice pass, it's one Jones probably should have had, though I guess 5-2, 6-2 doesn't make much of a difference. I don't know. But just in general, it wasn't a great game from Martin Jones, but I don't think it looks as terrible as the scoreboard would indicate, sort of like I don't think the Sharks looked as terrible as the scoreboard would indicate. Next, I'll be talking about John Leonard. He gets called up from the Barracuda and inserted into the lineup here, and it was not particularly successful. In fact, I almost didn't even know that, I knew John Leonard was in the lineup, but if I had not known the lineup previously, I did not even notice Leonard until about 5 minutes into the second period, which is not a great look for a player. Leonard was more or less completely ineffective at this point, so we'll see if this rotating carousel now of this third line winger will continue. We saw Balcers in the role, we saw Chmelevski not in that specific role, but in the lineup and changing up a bit of the bottom 6, and now we've seen John Leonard once again returning to the lineup, and it didn't look all that great. Next, I'll be talking about penalties here for the Sharks, because in the past couple of games, they've gotten into a lot of trouble with this. 7 minors here tonight. They took 4 minors against the Kings in their first game against them, as well as 5 minors the previous night against the Anaheim Ducks. And of course, the Sharks' penalty kill was top in the league last season, so it wasn't necessarily the worst thing in the world to take some penalties, but it has been sort of deteriorating a bit here so far this season. They've had some issues killing penalties, and it ended up being the case here tonight. They give up the goal to Kopitar, they give up the goal, I guess, technically to Iafallo, they give up the goal to Carter, and this just needs to be something to clean up. You know, they're taking careless, too many men on the ice penalties, they're taking useless offensive zone slashing penalties from the likes of Evander Kane, who honestly in the past few games, he has cleaned up his act a bit penalty-wise, but here tonight, definitely an egregious one that really ends up putting the Sharks out of range in this game. So that's definitely something the Sharks need to clean up when it comes to trying to play the full 60 minutes that they really haven't had at all thus far this season. And finally, I'll mention Knyzhov, Sharks' 6th defenseman. He's quickly becoming one of my favorite players on the San Jose Sharks. Honestly, if you had told me at the start of this season, or if you had asked me at the start of the season, which of these following 3 things were the most unlikely between the Sharks solidifying a strong top 6 forward group, the Sharks getting bounce back years from Martin Jones or decent goaltending from Devan Dubnyk, or the Sharks finding a consistent and good 6th defender, I would probably say finding a 6th defender was the least likely scenario to happen, because Jones was once a very good goaltender in the NHL and he could technically bounce back, and as long as Donato was pretty solid, the Sharks had a decent top 6 forward group, but I really didn't see any name that popped out besides maybe Ryan Merkley, who could possibly be a decent to good 6th defenseman for this group. But Knyzhov has not only jumped into this role and filled it decently, he's jumped into this role and filled it extremely well. Knyzhov has been very impressive many nights. In a game where the Sharks lost 6-2, though I guess 3 of the goals against were on the power play, he ended up being a +1, which, you know, plus minus is not a great stat, but still. And as I said, he just seems to be making a lot of the times the right play. It kind of reminds me of when Shemek had burst onto the scene for the Sharks a couple years back, playing with Brent Burns and really being a solid force with Burns and solidifying that top pairing. While Knyzhov is, of course, still just on the 3rd pairing in this situation because the Sharks don't really have a lot of wiggle room to move upwards in the lineup, I still say he has been extremely impressive thus far this season, and as I said, becoming one of my favorite Sharks players. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, as they will have finally their home opener after a 12-game road trip against the Vegas Golden Knights. Class dismissed.